On April 14th, 2011, I released my first episode of Anime Abandon, which was an embarrassing video about an equally embarrassing anime, Psychic Wars.
I'll admit that I'm being very unfair to Psychic Wars, but what do you expect me to say when they have a steroid freak doctor punch an evil Staryu in the face?
And now, 10 years and 249 episodes later, I'm still making embarrassing videos, just not always on embarrassing anime. The more things change, am I right? Regardless, I would have never dreamed in a million years that I would be making this series for a decade when I got the sudden urge to make the first episode all those years ago. These past 10 years have been some of the most fun, challenging, exhausting, and yet personally rewarding I've ever had. And it's thanks to all of you that not only was I able to keep the show going, but I was able to grow and mature as a content creator. So I wanted this milestone episode to begin and end with thank you. Thank you to everyone who followed me and the show through all the changes, the disruptions, and the delays. Thank you to everyone who helped spread the show through links, tweets, and posts. Thank you to those who showed support in your comments and likes. And a huge thank you to everyone who ever showed their support by becoming a patron on Patreon. Without each and every one of your contributions, Anime Abandoned would not have made it to year 2, let alone year 10. I hope that my work going forward with every future episode shows my gratitude, because all I have is gratitude for all of you. So please, join me in Anime Abandoned's 10th anniversary, Serial Experiments Lain.
Shut the door.
Blast that booty with the Galoo Glamorizer!
Killer bees and fire ants are coming to kill you.
The new Kablanco Turbo Dart Cannon.
Next on Flopsy, the friendly frog.
My deadbeat deceased husband. Next on Six and One.
Right off the bat, I think the very first thing that needs to be said about Serial Experiments Lain is that it is one of the very few scant anime that can truly be called unique. And that would be putting it lightly. Originally broadcast on TV Tokyo in 1998 before coming stateside when Pioneer licensed the series for a North American audience in 1999, Lain has garnered something akin to a cult following over the last 22 years. Remarkable considering that anime, in of itself, is already a niche interest. I originally became aware of Serial Experiments Lain during the early mid-2000s through word of mouth. It was one of those kinds of anime that the teenage mind couldn't help but build a personal mythology around. Descriptions of the series and its story were vague, and often people would use terms like postmodern and cyberpunk to describe it, alien words for the uninitiated and unaware, and it did little to describe the series proper for those on the outside looking in. So what could a teenage shithead like me do but openly wonder what kind of anime could be described in such a way? Of course, I wouldn't have been able to grapple with the show in any meaningful way at the time, even if I did have ready access to the show. Not without another 10 or so years under my belt, at least. Because, well, Serial Experiments Lain generally garners this kind of response.
I have no idea what's going on.
There is a lot to explore here, and we're gonna have to go into some heavy spoilers to do it, so if you haven't seen Serial Experiments Lain, oh boy. This is gonna be fun. In the interests of keeping everyone on track, Serial Experiments Lain is an original series set in a somewhat ambiguous future.
Present day. Present time.
At least it was ambiguous in 1998. A major global communications network that's not unlike our internet, called The Wired, has interfaced with nearly every facet of modern society, to the point where the line dividing the wired and real life is becoming more and more irrelevant.
I asked some geeks. I met them on The Wired a while ago. They always have the inside track on this kind of thing. They said it might be the Knights. The Knights?
The eponymous Lane Iwakura is a middle school student who seems to be the only one in her class who is detached from the Wired. But when a fellow classmate, Chisa Yamoda, commits suicide, rumors about her sending emails from beyond the grave begin milling. Curious to see if these rumors have any truth, Lane makes an earnest attempt to connect to the Wired, and it quickly becomes apparent that she is connected to something more. Of the many interesting aspects of Serial Experiments Lain, the most immediate and striking is definitely the visuals. While the technical animation of the show is among the elite for its time, it alone doesn't tell the whole story. Indeed, the story of the anime is reflected in the visual language of the anime, specifically in how the show is lit and colored. You don't need me to tell you all that Serial Experiments Lain could be labeled as a supernatural psychological thriller because the show looks like a supernatural psychological thriller. Hard, contrasted lighting and shadows, flat and muted color palette, Lain has a very distinctive look and feel that helps communicate the immediate theme of the story. Watching Lain, one can't help but feel a sense of unease, even during relatively benign scenes of the characters just going about their everyday life.
Mom?
Yes?
I got an email from a friend today. It was from this girl I know who killed herself last week.
There's nothing that screams, "this is wrong," but something isn't right either. Perhaps it's the way the characters are often drawn with vacant, thousand-yard stares, or how the setting is often washed out in blinding white light. In such a world, no wonder so many people practically live on the Wired, where the world can conform or contort to whatever they desire.
No matter where my body is at any particular time, I can release my consciousness anywhere I want, anytime I want.
But it's these same connections, or rather the want and need for these connections, that strengthen and drive the overall theme of the story. It's outstandingly commendable how the show was able to not only build its own aesthetic, but have it relate to the story itself. This level of cohesion where story and art are able to inform and contrast each other is quite rare, and is exemplified wonderfully at the outset of the show when Lain asks her father to help her get on the Wired.
In the real world, or the wired world, people are connected somehow. That's how societies are created. You should broaden your horizons.
Even when the plot wanders into obtuse, hard-to-follow territory, the tension that is communicated through its aesthetic is compelling enough to grab the viewer's attention. Indeed, even as the world of The Wired seems a million miles away from Lane's everyday life, there are constant reminders of its presence tucked away in the minutiae. Blotches of what might be blood stain the shadows that the light of the sun can't seem to penetrate, and even the louder-than-it-should-be hum of power lines breaks the otherwise silent air, never letting Lain forget that the Wired is waiting for her to connect again. For my money, I don't believe there has ever been an anime that has gotten so much out of sound mixing than Serial Experiments Lain.
It's just an advanced medium for communication. Don't ever get it confused with the real world.
But I have an inkling that all of this can strike a little Y2K-ish. Just a little bit. I mean, for those of us who remember the hysteria and fear surrounding the World Wide Web, as well as the prophesied singularity that when the clock turns midnight on January 1st, 2000, our microwaves will think it's 1900 and will rise along with our TI-83 calculators and G3 IMAX to kill all humans, and how, it didn't happen. Well, seeing anything that portrays technology to be an harbinger of doom with those memories and with modern sensibilities, it can come off as quaint, But I feel it's important to remember that this anime series was created in the mid to late 90s, a period of time that is arguably one of the most important leaps forward in the history of technology. According to US Census data captured by the Current Population Survey taken in 1984, only about 8% of US households polled had a computer, and over 50% of that total stated that they were still learning how to use it. 9 years later, CPS pulled the data again, showing that barely over 20% of households had a computer in 1993. But between 1993 and 1997, the rate of computer ownership had exploded to nearly 40%, almost doubling the growth rate in about half the time, culminating in 2000 where half of all US households polled had a computer, a rate of change that's only matched by the rate of growth of US households that had an internet subscription, which went from less than 20% in 1997 to over 40% in 2000. Rest assured, while these numbers only reflect the stats of the United States, Japan was just as quick and eager to hop on the information superhighway.
A standardized world in which everyone shares the same integrated information.
While there are numerous factors that contributed to this growth, none were as important and formative than the lowering of the bar of entry, what the industry dubbed frictionless use. After Windows 3.1 made interacting with a computer not require a bachelor's degree in computer science just so you can boot up a program in DOS, anyone and everyone that had the curiosity could purchase and, more importantly, use a computer. But with a growing user base that wasn't technologically savvy, as well as a rapidly accelerating path of technological development, it was becoming clear that there were many people that not only didn't get computers, but also didn't trust them.
It's almost become an idol, like the 10 hours that my son stays in front of the computer. So it's maybe only just that this idol comes crashing down.
You can kind of understand where a lot of these people were coming from. New things that are unlike anything you have used or experienced before can always be jarring. And there was nothing like the internet, at least not for the everyday layman. And I don't think I need to tell you that Hollywood sure does love the everyday layman. While there had always been an element of technology run-amok narratives in science fiction before the advent of the internet, some might pointing toward Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as its origin, it has to be said that the technophobic subgenre enjoyed something of a resurgence in the 90s as filmmakers tapped into that very real sense of unease and fear of the unknowable, scary computer box. Suddenly, it wasn't enough that our stories tried to scare us with aliens trying to conquer our world, they have to turn us into computerized, obedient cyborgs.
What's wrong with you?
Nothing, no.
We took a completely unrelated Stephen King story about a satyr making human sacrifices to Pan, the goat god, and turned it into a story about an intellectually disabled gardener becoming a god through the power of virtual reality.
The Lawnmower Man.
Even Star Trek, the paragon of optimistic sci-fi, introduced their most dire threat in a cybernetic collective that assimilates organic matter for no other reason than it being their purpose.
Your resistance is hopeless. Number one.
Okay, so the Borg were introduced in 1989, but that just means Star Trek was ahead of the curve. Again. Likewise, Japan had its own weariness and caution when it came to technology. While as a country and economic power, they were quick to adopt and manufacture new technology, Japan was, and still is, a traditionalist society that also just so happened to be formed by Shinto, with around 80% of the entire population practicing some form or rites of the religion. That is to say, they may not identify themselves as Shintoists, but do observe and take part in Shinto rituals. Now, I don't really have the time to go into even just a cursory overview of the tenets of Shintoism, but for the sake of clarity, one of the core precepts of Shinto is the belief that there should be a balance and harmony between humanity and the natural world. And what on earth could be more unnatural than, well... A more on-the-nose example of the dichotomy in Japan's relationship with technology can be found in another of Katsuhiro Otomo's work, Roshin Z, as it centers around not only on technology infiltrating the relationship between the older generation and the younger, but also technology infiltrating the relationship between humanity at large and the natural world. Of course, both Japan's and America's technophobic fears are rooted in different places in their respective societies, but it's still fear all the same. And yet... On the flip side to all of these fears, there was also a fascinating resurgent genre that enjoyed underground status in the 80s before going relatively mainstream in the 90s, a genre that speculated on what all this new technology means for the human race, cyberpunk. And hasn't that name been put through the ringer lately? Now, this isn't to say that cyberpunk started in the 90s, as authors like Harlan Ellison and Philip K. Dick wrote many a formative and foundational story in the 60s, but nearly every piece of fiction that had been canonized as cyberpunk from the 60s until the early 90s all operated on a base speculation of how technology would advance and, more importantly, how society would warp and twist itself around it. It took until the early 90s for actual, real-world technology to catch up to the beat that books like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Neuromancer were laying down sometimes decades before. It truly felt like we were all living in the future we had been hearing about for years. Suddenly, virtual reality looked like it was actually possible. Computers were only getting faster, more reliable, and cheaper to boot. And now, with the advent of the internet, it seemed like no bit of information could ever go unknown. And that is pretty damn cool. By the way, if you want a more in-depth look at how American media, in particular American sci-fi, helped influence Japanese society as well as their media, check out my review of Bubblegum Crisis right there. In a cyberpunk story, technology is not something to be feared, but something that is essentially a natural extension of the self. We are dependent upon technology not because we are weak and dim-witted and lost our way, but because we have come to understand technology as a necessity, same as any natural organ or limb. But in cyberpunk, there is a fear to be had, and it's found in those that hold technology's keys.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
Antagonists in cyberpunk stories are often portrayed as suits, cold and unfeeling to the harm they and their companies and/or government are doing. But what's unique in their position as antagonists is that by the time the plot starts, they've already won. Alex Murphy may have put a new hole in Dick Jones's chest and sent him flying out of a window, but OCP will still go on being a merciless, faceless conglomerate. Roy Batty may have crushed Eldon Tyrell's skull like a grape, but that won't give him an extra day of life, nor will it shut down the corporation responsible for the replicants either. Which can all seem a bit nihilistic, granted, but it's not like our protagonists are without some kind of emotional catharsis or epiphany. In the absence of a traditional might makes right ending where the good guy bests the bad guy and the day is saved, our protagonist is instead reminded of the value of his own existence, or reclaims an identity that was stolen from him.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
Nice shooting, son. What's your name? Murphy.
Cyberpunk illustrates a world where the danger lies not in what humanity produces, but in how quick we are to let go of what makes us who we are in the pursuit of gratification, be it material or chemical, to those that stand to profit from us losing ourselves. Technology is not something to fear, it is something to reclaim. Identity.
Are you and the Lain and the Wired in reality one and the same person? Who are you, Lain?
I'm...
Consumerism.
What is it?
Oh, a Navi, ma'am. A new model, probably. I wish I had one.
I could buy it. My home job makes me extra money.
Anti-authoritarianism.
I'll call the police. Who the hell are you?
Go ahead. But what could you possibly say to them when we're not even here?
Mind-altering drugs. All common touchstones in the cyberpunk genre, and all present and accounted for in Serial Experiments Lain. And yet, it seems almost unfair to just call the show another cyberpunk story, because it isn't like any other cyberpunk story out there. Despite the many colors and creeds that cyberpunk stories come in, they nearly all have one thing in common. You are aware who the antagonists are, and how they relate to the protagonists. Whereas with Serial Experiments Lain, over the course of its 13-episode run, the viewer rarely gets a foothold in what the threat really is. From episode to episode, the plot goes in circles, often driven by forces outside of Lain. Pragmatically speaking, Lain, at least in the first half of the series, doesn't have much agency in what she does or why she's doing it. not helped by the fact that the series has a habit of having a plot of the day kind of narrative, while also refusing to relate these plot lines into the overall story. The series might have started with the suicide of Chisa Yamada, but after the second episode, she's rarely brought up again, and she doesn't really have an impact on the story until the very end of the series.
It's not true. There's nothing easy about dying. Never is.
Instead, the show switches focus on a growing drug epidemic, but then leaves the story dangling by the end of its episode to switch to another plot line, which then the series leaves dangling again without any kind of resolution. The end result of the series feels like a million little threads of story that are loosely woven together by the narrative, but never cohesively. And that is by design. Lain is keenly aware of the tropes in its own genre, and more importantly, how we relate them to our modern world. True to form, there is a physical presence of a threat in the prototypical G-men, Carl and Lynn. Hold on, wait a minute. Agents Carl and Lynn. Agents K and L. Ah, you son of a bitch, I see what you did there. But despite Lain and her family being accosted by the men in black, there is never a sense that these men are here to do anything to or for Lain. Their goals lie in the elimination of the Knights of the Eastern Calculus, a faction of hackers determined to achieve enlightenment through the discovery of a universal singular truth. And while Lain and the Knights' path do cross, tangentially speaking, it's difficult to call them the true antagonists either, since we never get a real beat on them. There are constant echoes of both the men in black and the knights out cat and mousing each other, but it is rarely an actual part of the story, amounting many times to a throwaway line of exposition.
You hunted all of the knights all over the world. Our associates are now on their way to dispose of them as quickly as possible.
Despite the fanciful plot elements and setting and sometimes even characters, the basic structure of a cyberpunk story is just that. Pretty basic. And this is where Serial Experiments Lain really sets itself apart. Lain is unconcerned with the thought of the powerful steering the wheel of technology or whether or not they know the forces they trifle with. Ultimately, it doesn't matter who the knights are, or who any of the men in black are, or who they work for. In fact, very little of the show from a storytelling perspective really matters by the time the last episode ends. Instead, the anime seems more focused on exploring a question of how technology relates to the human condition. The anime recognizes the ethos of cyberpunk and rhetorically asks in response, if technology is supposed to be an extension of ourselves, then why do we fear it? And it seems to arrive at the conclusion that we just don't know ourselves as much as we think we do.
We still haven't figured out just exactly what you are. We'll probably never know for certain.
And this line of thinking strikes at the heart of the conflict of the entire series. The conflict between modernism and postmodernism. Okay. It's a big ask for all of you to sit there and allow me to spiel for hours on such a macro topic, so I'm going to risk distilling each of these decades-old schools of thought for the purposes of this episode. If you want a more direct but nonetheless accurate summation between the two, I highly recommend this episode of Regular Car Reviews. Now, you can't really define postmodernism without first defining modernism. So, what is modernism? Or at least, what is modernism in an anime context? Well, I suppose the best and most upfront example of modernism in anime is probably Evangelion. To say nothing of the fact that Eva was and still is a deconstruction of the giant robot genre, the last two episodes of the series is the most on-the-nose example in anime of what modernist art in all its forms strives to attain. Modernism is the idea that truth is ultimate, and the only way to attain truth is through the realization and affirmation of individual effort. Ultimately, Shinji Ikari's arc is him coming to terms with his own agency, and that despite his feelings towards his past, as well as his feelings towards himself and those around him, he always has had the power to direct his life the way he sees fit. That his life has value and meaning. He is not powerless, but powerful.
My life is worth living here!
Postmodernism, on the other hand, is the belief that any effort applied to the realization of truth is bullshit, because truth doesn't matter. because nothing matters. And that's why everything is beautiful. If modernists believe that our purpose is to build toward truth, to create order out of chaos, and by doing so we achieve, then postmodernists believe that any effort toward order is doomed to fail, if not by human intervention, then by the inevitable end brought on by the heat death of the universe, and us coming to that realization allows us to see the beauty in its finite existence. To look at this purely ideological conflict in a more tangible sense, it's easier if we conceptualize postmodernism as a direct response to modernist society, that what we are told we have achieved feels like a lie when we actually look at it. A point of conflict that is brought to the forefront in very direct and real-world terms in the film Patlabor 2.
We now put the same effort into indifference that our parents put into war. Other countries, comfortably far away, pay the price for our prosperous peace. We've learned very well how to ignore their suffering.
Now, filtering all of what I just said into a story about a girl falling down the rabbit hole, so to speak, by logging onto the internet seems far-fetched, granted, but the conflict is still the same, and roots from a distinct dissatisfaction of modern society. Lain portrays a world where being online and being IRL are one and the same, to the detriment of our collective consciousness. In such a world as Lain's, truth becomes irrelevant when both the unbelievable and the tragic occurs, and the population seems apathetic. A mass shooting happens in a nightclub.
He's got a gun!
And not even the witnesses seem to care the very next day.
Oh, you were screaming the whole time. You didn't even see his face.
I saw his feet.
We saw someone actually die right in front of us, but we're acting like it's something we saw in some kind of a horror movie or something.
Even when the clouds part and the visage of Lain peers through a crack in the sky, offering undeniable proof of a divine being, it too falls by the wayside of an indifferent public, propped up only by the faithful hands of the youth. If truth matters, but no one is listening, what good is truth? Now, certainly this can all come across as fatalistic and self-defeating if Serial Experiments Lain had nothing to offer the audience other than, well, ain't that some bullshit? But thankfully, it has more than just that. That the anime surrounds itself with red herrings, perfunctory characters, and dangling plot threads, it's easy to overlook that at the core of the story, riding side saddle to all of these heady topics is Lain trying to make a real connection, and realizing that she already had one, with her friend Alice.
You were always my closest friend, even without ever connecting with me, Alice.
Connecting? What are you saying?
Chisa may be the trigger point of the plot, but Alice is the heart of the story. Throughout the entire anime, only Alice truly cares about what is happening to Lain, and is the only one capable of reaching through to her in the climax of the series.
It feels like your body's cold, but you're alive, Lain. Here, give me your hand. I'm alive too. You see?
The show started with a theme of connection, and it ends with that very same theme. Yes, we do live in a world where we can connect with anyone, but how we do it should never erase the fact that at the other end of that connection is another human being. And the fact that we can do that at all is a beautiful thing. I knew I was going to talk about Serial Experiments Lain for a while, and I knew I was going to reserve it for a special occasion, but what ultimately spurred me to make this episode was a joke. I came across Abigail Thorne's video, The Philosophy of Anime, which was made before she came out as a trans woman, and I was tickled when I watched it and realized that it was just a 20-minute shitpost / love letter to Lasagna Cat.
The anime that I saw on that day that changed my life, changed me, was called Tenchi Muyo Ryo-Oki.
I thought it was hilarious and funny, and I really have to commend Abigail for committing to a bit, but something irked me. While it was a joke pointed at herself and certainly the audience, I mean, come on, it was released on April 1st for crying out loud, it was also a joke that continued the general attitude of anime being predominantly waifu and spank bank material.
Oh, Washu-chan. Or is it Washu-sama?
And I didn't think that was fair. Now, I'm not saying that she should have known better or that I believe that any real harm is done by her making the video. But I feel like anime itself is often the butt of jokes for the simple reason of it existing, and truth be known, I also feel that we fans of anime often propagate that, albeit ironically. I mean, the fact that we call ourselves and our fandom trash, it kind of seems like we agree with that sentiment, doesn't it? I mean, for crying out loud, we've made this a meme! Maybe it's just a simple case of irony poisoning, or maybe we as a fandom are more inclined to be self-deprecating, but I feel we need to re-examine our relationship with anime. We can like the fan service shows, we can like shonen action series, and we can like the heady, challenging titles because they all exist. Aiken is just as much anime as Jinro, and what we like or dislike about either one means nothing to the medium as a whole because no one singular anime can define or represent the medium. Every anime has the right to exist and can share a unique relationship with you, the viewer. Whether it's a relationship built on love, hate, indifference, or anything in between, feelings towards one is rarely identical with another. If we can understand film as a non-monolithic entity that is capable of telling stories that may have a lot to do with each other or nothing to do with each other at all, then we can understand anime as just that. At the beginning of Anime Abandon, I called anime a genre, and I couldn't have been further from the truth. It took me 10 years and 250 episodes to come to the conclusion that anime is worth preserving and examining under its own merits and no one else's. And I will continue to do just that. And I can do that because of all of you. Once again, thank you all so very much for these 10 years. You've been wonderful, and I am eternally grateful to you. Now, it's time to prep for episode 251, and quite frankly, I'm looking forward to it because it's an anime that I've been wanting to talk about on Anime Abandoned since practically episode 1. Till next time.